thief. That was the word she spit out before the police officer even stepped onto my driveway, before his hand dropped toward his holster like he was walking into an armed standoff, instead of onto the property I paid for, lived in, protected, and built a life around. I stood there holding my own Amazon package, my own name printed across the label in black ink, and yet Karen Whitmore, the HOA's self-appointed surveillance queen, acted like she'd caught a criminal in the middle of a felony. The officer didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't ask whether I lived here. He demanded ID before I could breathe, demanding it again and again with that same cold tone that told me he'd already made up his mind. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from guilt, not from fear of what I'd done, but from the violence humming behind his posture. I could see my daughter in the window, her little face pressed to the glass, watching her father be treated like a trespasser on his own land. Before we move forward, drop a comment from where are you watching right now? Because what I'm about to walk you through is the reason so many of us never really feel safe, even in the homes we fight our whole lives to afford. But that's not even the half of it. I saw Karen standing behind the officer, her arms crossed, her lips curled into the kind of smile that only grows on someone who believes they've finally found the proof they've been hoping for. She watched me like she'd already rehearsed this moment in her head, like she'd been waiting for the emergency lights to flash across my lawn so she could say, "See? I told you he didn't belong." She didn't bother hiding her satisfaction. It poured off her like cheap perfume. She had been circling my life ever since she moved across the street, a clipboard parasite obsessed with policing every inch of my driveway, every package I touched, every step I took. And now she had upgraded her harassment into a full-blown police escalation. Her voice was so sweet when she spoke to the officer, pretending she was just concerned about neighborhood safety. But I heard the venom beneath it. I heard the hunger. I heard the thrill. This wasn't about a package. This wasn't about an HOA guideline. This was about Karen trying to criminalize me, a black homeowner, because the sight of me carrying my own mail offended whatever twisted order she believed this neighborhood owed her. The officer stepped closer. His thumb rested on the snap of his holster. I moved slowly toward my wallet, because I knew exactly how fast this could become deadly. I've worked with trauma patients. I've held collapsing lungs with my own hands. I've seen what a single bad second of judgment can do, so I kept my movements calm, deliberate, controlled. Karen whispered something to the officer. I couldn't hear it, but I saw the way his jaw tightened. She had poisoned the waters long before today, filing complaint after complaint, pushing her narrative of me as a suspicious outsider. Every time I walked outside, she stared. Every time a package arrived, she waited. Every time my schedule ran late because surgery kept me past midnight, she stood at her window watching like she expected me to carry contraband from my own car. And now she was about to witness the moment she'd been fantasizing about, me in cuffs, humiliated in front of my family, reduced to the stereotype she needed me to be. Here's where everything blew apart. The officer asked for proof of residency again, even though he was standing in front of my door with Williams mounted on a steel plate right beside him. He ignored the pediatric chalk drawings my kids had made on the walkway. He ignored the security sign planted in the garden bed. He ignored the framed family photos visible through the living room window. He ignored everything except the story Karen fed him. My voice stayed steady as I answered because panic is a luxury people like me are rarely allowed. My daughter's silhouette trembled behind the glass. My son stepped beside her, confused, scared, too young to understand how a morning could turn into a battlefield. Karen lifted her chin like she was conducting a neighborhood cleansing ritual. She wanted this. She needed this. She lived for this. She gestured towards the package in my hand, telling the officer she'd seen me steal several like it. She said the word steal with that dramatic emphasis people use when they want to make a lie feel inevitable. The officer asked if I would consent to questioning. Karen leaned in like she expected him to tell me to get on the ground. My throat tightened, but my voice didn't. I told him calmly that the package was mine, addressed to me, delivered to my house. I turned it toward him so he could read the label. He barely glanced at it before returning to Karen, as if her narrative mattered more than the truth sitting in his hand. That was the moment my fear edged into fury. Not loud, explosive fury, but the cold, controlled kind that sharpens your vision and empties everything except the will to survive. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a power-drunk HOA cultist using the police like her own personal enforcement squad, all because she couldn't stand the sight of me existing without her permission. Karen stepped closer, too close, her voice dripping false innocence. She said she had photos. She said she'd documented ongoing suspicious behavior. She said she'd been forced to monitor my home because she didn't feel safe. And that word, safe, hit me like a brick. Safe from what? Safe from whom? Safe from the man mowing his lawn? Safe from the father taking his kids to school? Safe from the surgeon saving lives during double shifts? Safe from the black neighbor who didn't ask for her gaze, her opinions, or her obsession? The officer asked if she could show him the photos. She smiled like she'd been waiting for that invitation. She pulled out her phone and displayed grainy images of me picking up packages from my porch, mundane moments she twisted into evidence. My stomach dropped when I realized she had been photographing me for weeks, maybe months, watching, documenting, obsessing. But that wasn't even the half of it. When the officer asked if there were any other witnesses, Karen gestured toward the street with a sweeping motion that implied the entire neighborhood agreed with her. Curtains shifted in nearby windows. Cars slowed. People watched but said nothing. The silence wrapped itself around me like a noose. Silence can be more violent than words. Silence is consent for people like Karen. The officer's radio crackled. Backup was on the way. My daughter cried in the window. My wife appeared behind her, frozen. My hand tightened around the package so hard the cardboard crumpled beneath my fingers. I knew I had to break this cycle before Karen escalated it into something irreversible. I told the officer I had security cameras installed around the porch. Karen's confidence cracked instantly. Her body jerked as if she'd been slapped. The officer shifted. His stance loosened. He asked where the footage was. I pointed to the screen inside. He hesitated. Karen objected loudly, claiming the footage could be doctored. She stuttered for the first time since the confrontation began. She looked rattled. She looked unstable. She looked guilty. The officer requested to review it. Karen protested again. The officer shut her down. Her voice trembled as she insisted she had more evidence. But her face told the real story, the fear of being exposed. We stepped inside. The footage loaded. The timestamp showed me picking up my package peacefully, casually, normally. No theft, no criminal act. Just a homeowner retrieving his delivery. The officer stared silently. Karen hovered outside the door like a vampire barred from entering. Her voice cracked through the screen as she shouted accusations from the driveway. The officer ignored her. My daughter wiped her eyes. My wife squeezed my shoulder. The truth played on the monitor in crisp clarity while Karen's lies shriveled in daylight. But here's where everything blew apart. The officer's radio confirmed the reporting party's device ID. It matched every anonymous complaint the HOA had received about me for the past month. Every single one came from Karen. Each accusation, each manipulated photo, each fabricated claim of danger. All of it traced back to one person, one obsession, one HOA parasite who weaponized the neighborhood against me because she couldn't tolerate the shade of the man living across the street. The officer stepped back outside and told Karen he needed a statement from her. Her bravado evaporated, her excuses tangled, her lies tripped over each other, her voice cracked under pressure. The HOA president, who arrived moments earlier hoping to support her narrative, slowly backed away as the truth surfaced. Karen insisted she was the victim. The officer reminded her that filing false reports is a crime. She recoiled like she'd been slapped. And in that moment, in that shift of power, in that unraveling, I felt something cold and controlled settle in my chest. Not triumph, not relief, just clarity. This wasn't over. This was the beginning of her collapse. And she didn't even see it coming. I wasn't always the man standing in a driveway being treated like a criminal for picking up his own package. Before Riverside Meadows twisted itself around Karen's paranoia, my life was built on precision, discipline, and purpose. I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon. I spent 8 years in the Army patching up soldiers in combat zones where chaos could swallow a man whole in seconds. I learned how to steady my hands under mortar fire, how to keep my voice calm while blood spilled across the floor, how to maintain control when everything around me screamed for panic. When you spend your life on the edge of life and death, you learn how to move with intention. You learn how to carry your own authority. You learn how to survive people who think they know who you are before you open your mouth. But nothing in Afghanistan prepared me for the quiet violence of an HOA Karen who believed she owned the neighborhood and that my presence contaminated it. I came to Riverside Meadows because I wanted peace. I wanted my kids to grow up riding their bikes down clean sidewalks. I wanted my wife, Jennifer, to have community. I wanted a home that felt like a reward for years of sacrifice. And for a while, we had that. But peace is fragile in neighborhoods where people like Karen are given power. Riverside Meadows sold itself as the model suburban sanctuary. Well-kept lawns, meticulously painted mailboxes, a community pool, a holiday parade, and HOA bylaws thick enough to choke a horse. None of that bothered me. I've lived under stricter rules. I've followed regulations more complex than anything a suburban committee could imagine. My wife loved the neighborhood the moment she saw it. And when we bought the 4-bedroom house on Maple Lane, it felt like we'd stepped into the chapter of our lives we'd been writing toward for years. My daughter Sophie ran through the empty living room laughing. My son MJ fell asleep in the car before we even moved in. Jennifer cried, holding the fresh keys in her hand. It was supposed to be the start of something beautiful. And for almost 3 years, it was. The neighbors waved. The HOA board kept to themselves. My shifts at the hospital were long but fulfilling. Jennifer thrived at the Children's Cancer Center. We had dinners on the porch, birthday parties on the lawn, movie nights with the glow spilling out of the living room windows. Then Karen arrived, and the air changed. I remember the exact moment she stepped out of her silver Lexus, wearing a pink visor, yoga pants pressed tighter than her smile, and sunglasses that she lifted just enough to look at me like she was calibrating a threat assessment. Jennifer, ever the optimist, walked across the street to welcome her. I watched from a distance as Karen's eyes flicked toward me, then away, then back again, studying me with that tight discomfort people get when their bigotry hasn't yet learned how to hide itself. Jennifer pointed toward me with a friendly gesture, but Karen's smile never reached her eyes. Something in my gut twisted. Not because she seemed rude, not because she seemed standoffish, but because she seemed like someone who needed control of everything around her, and who wouldn't tolerate anything that didn't fit into the world she curated inside her head. And I knew immediately that I didn't fit. At first, her actions were small, subtle surveillance disguised as neighborhood curiosity. She'd check her mail whenever I came home, even if it was 8 at night. She'd water her plants only when I was outside. She'd walk her tiny white dog along the exact stretch of sidewalk where she could watch my driveway without looking like that's what she was doing. I'd feel the weight of her eyes on me while mowing the lawn, while buckling my kids into the car, while carrying groceries. Jennifer brushed it off, saying Karen was probably just lonely after her divorce. But I'd seen that look before, in war zones and hospitals, in people who stare a little too long, who analyze a little too deeply, who position themselves like they're gathering intel. I wasn't dealing with loneliness. I was dealing with someone who believed she needed to manage the reality around her. And I was the part of reality she didn't trust. The first HOA email should have been a warning shot. "Suspicious activity report," it said in bold. "Follow-up required." I opened it expecting a spam alert or a community notice, but instead, it was a pixelated photo of me holding a package on my own porch, paired with a paragraph describing a male individual of unknown residency engaging in repeated retrieval of deliveries not confirmed to be his. The HOA sent it to every address in the community without so much as a phone call to verify anything. It didn't matter that I'd lived there for years. It didn't matter that my mortgage was paid automatically from my account, that my name was etched into county records. A single complaint from a white woman with a clipboard held more weight than my entire existence. I was reduced to a silhouette in a blurry image, stripped of identity, presumed guilty simply because someone didn't like the color of the man bending to pick up a cardboard box. That was the moment the piece Jennifer and I built began to fracture. But the moment that solidified everything, the moment I knew Karen was not just nosy but dangerous, came when her behavior escalated into full surveillance. Every time I reviewed my notes app, I saw the pattern. May 3rd, May 7th, May 12th, Karen in the driveway, Karen in the window, Karen appearing within 30 seconds of my arrival home, as if she had my schedule programmed into her nerves. She even began stepping outside at random intervals in the middle of the day to check on something, always glancing toward my house. Jennifer tried to reassure me that it was coincidental. But I didn't believe in coincidences that repeated with this level of precision. I didn't believe in accidents that grew more calculated over time. And I didn't believe for a second that Karen's behavior had anything to do with gardening. The real shift happened when packages began to disappear. You expect porch theft in a city. You don't expect it in a suburban development where every house has a Ring camera and every neighbor thinks they're contributing to a utopian community. Yet packages vanished from my porch with surgical precision. Only when I wasn't home, only when Jennifer was distracted with the kids, only when Karen had a clear view from her front window. And every time a package disappeared, an HOA email followed hours later recounting suspicious activity at my address. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't mischief. It was orchestration. Karen was building a narrative, brick by brick, email by email, accusation by accusation. She weaponized the neighborhood watch into a personal crusade against me. And each time I tried to address it through proper channels, the HOA responded with dismissive platitudes about community vigilance, as if my identity made me the obvious suspect regardless of my homeownership, my profession, or my record of service. Still, I stayed calm. That's what discipline does. It teaches you not to react on impulse. It teaches you to collect yourself even when danger circles your throat. But calm didn't mean I wasn't furious. Calm didn't mean I didn't feel the weight of what this all meant. Calm didn't mean I didn't understand the power dynamics at play. Karen wasn't just another annoying neighbor. She was a petty overlord pretending to be the HOA's guardian, a surveillance creep who used procedures she barely understood to create a fiction that made her feel important. And the HOA president, Craig Henderson, let her do it because people like him are always more comfortable believing a white woman's narrative than listening to a black homeowner calmly explaining the truth. I had spent my entire adult life building a reputation grounded in excellence and integrity. I had served in war. I had saved lives under impossible pressure. I had earned respect through sweat, sacrifice, and knowledge. But the minute Karen decided I didn't belong, all of that became irrelevant. In her eyes, I was just a threat wrapped in skin she didn't trust. In the HOA's eyes, I was a problem worth monitoring. In the neighborhood's eyes, I became the whispered suspicion behind closed blinds. And the worst part was knowing how easily this could happen to any black family who dares to live somewhere they weren't expected. The packages kept disappearing. The emails kept coming. The stares intensified. And the tension in my own home became unbearable. Jennifer saw the exhaustion on my face. She heard the stress in my voice. She knew what this was doing to me. But even she didn't understand the depth of Karen's obsession until the day the officer came to the door, accusing me of stealing a laptop. That was when the illusion of safety finally shattered. Growing up in South Chicago, I learned early that safety is conditional when you're black. I learned that authority can turn hostile in seconds. I learned that innocence isn't a shield, and the truth doesn't always matter. But I didn't expect to relive those lessons as a 41-year-old homeowner in a quiet suburb with a 2-car garage and a manicured lawn. Riverside Meadows was supposed to be the place where my children never had to learn those lessons. But Karen taught them anyway. And once I realized that she would not stop, that the HOA would not stop enabling her, that the neighborhood would not stop believing her, that the lies would not stop growing, I understood I had to become the version of myself I used to be in war zones. Disciplined, strategic, unshakable. Not because I wanted to fight, but because I had no choice. And that was when I decided to stop absorbing the hits and start preparing for the counterstrike that would expose everything she'd been hiding. The deeper I dug into Riverside Meadows' HOA structure, the clearer it became that Karen hadn't just stumbled into power, she'd slithered into it through the cracks the board never bothered to seal. HOAs are supposed to manage landscaping rules, maintenance standards, community events, and the occasional broken sprinkler. But in neighborhoods like this, where the board is run by people who love authority more than accountability, the HOA becomes a stage for the power-drunk and the petty. And Karen understood that stage better than anyone. She embedded herself into the fabric of the association with the precision of a stalker mapping a target. She joined committees no one else wanted. She attended every meeting. She memorized bylaws nobody read. And she weaponized the language of safety and compliance until the board began treating her opinion like gospel. What she lacked in logic, she compensated for in volume and persistence. And the more she spoke, the more people listened. Craig Henderson, the HOA president, was the perfect partner for her delusions. A retired accountant with an inflated sense of self-importance, Craig treated the HOA like a miniature government, complete with power trips, procedural theatrics, and a desperate need to feel relevant. Karen fed that ego. She whispered concerns into his ear. She framed herself as the community watchdog, the hero preventing the neighborhood from sliding into chaos. Craig believed her because Karen knew exactly how to speak to men like him. Words dipped in faux responsibility, but sharpened enough to cut whoever she targeted. I became her ideal target, not because I violated any rule, but because I challenged the narrative she needed to maintain her position. And the moment she submitted that first suspicious activity report, she unlocked an abuse pipeline that the HOA had no safeguards against. Every email she sent was forwarded automatically. No verification, no questioning, no review. It didn't matter that I'd lived on Maple Lane longer than she had. It didn't matter that my name was on every HOA roster, every community directory, every property record. Karen had discovered the HOA's fatal flaw. They assumed white residents reported in good faith, and they assumed anyone who looked like me needed to be monitored. So when she submitted blurry photos of me retrieving my own packages, Craig didn't investigate. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't speak to me directly. He sent her report to the entire neighborhood with an official seal at the bottom and a line urging vigilance. Neighbors read those emails and didn't see Karen's fingerprints. They saw authority. They saw confirmation that their black neighbor wasn't just different, he was dangerous. That's how HOA abuse works. It doesn't come with slurs or shouting. It comes wrapped in procedure, coded in policy, delivered with the sterile tone of an automated email. But behind every sentence, Karen was tightening her grip. The second suspicious activity report came only days after the first. Another photo, another vague warning, another implication that I wasn't supposed to be where I belonged. Every detail was crafted to create distance between me and my own property. Male individual observed removing multiple packages. Residency status unverified. Possible misdelivery exploitation. These weren't mistakes. These were calculated attacks designed to make the neighborhood believe I was committing crimes before any crime existed. And the worst part was knowing the HOA had no interest in correcting the narrative. They were complicit not because they hated me, but because they trusted the person who did. Karen built her influence through consistency. She made herself the resident who cared too much, and in communities like this, that's enough to make your word law. The more she reported, the more confident she became. Soon she wasn't just watching me, she was orchestrating around me. She timed her surveillance to my work hours. She aligned her fabricated reports with package deliveries. She used the HOA newsletter to spread warnings about increased theft incidents, implying I was the reason the neighborhood needed to stay alert. And every time a neighbor avoided eye contact, every time a child was pulled away from mine at the park, every time a conversation went silent when I approached, I felt the weight of her campaign tightening around my throat. It wasn't just harassment. It was isolation engineered through HOA channels that were supposed to protect residents, not persecute them. Craig's role in all of this wasn't passive. He became the amplifier for Karen's paranoia. When I emailed requesting corrections to the first report, he responded with the kind of condescension that drips from men who think authority is a personality trait. He wrote that the HOA appreciates all resident contributions to safety, and that they cannot be expected to verify identities in every photo submitted. But he wasn't talking about verification. He was talking about hierarchy. In his eyes, Karen's complaints had more weight because Karen fit the mold of the type of resident the HOA was designed to serve. She looked like the neighborhood. I was the deviation. Once Karen framed me as a problem, Craig's job became reinforcing her narrative, whether he realized it or not. There were meetings where the board discussed increasing neighborhood surveillance, and guess whose house they used as the example? Mine. They brought up high delivery volume concerns, as though my profession or my family's needs somehow violated a rule. They debated quiet hours, implying my late-night returns from hospital shifts disrupted the peace. Not once did any board member reach out to me. They made decisions based on whispers, emails, and Karen's endless stream of fabricated evidence. It was a perfect system for someone like her. A structure with power, but no accountability. Authority, but no oversight. Reach, but no restraint. And every time she exploited it, she grew bolder. But the moment that changed everything was when I realized she was no longer operating alone. Her influence infected the neighborhood. People started sending her their own observations. He came home late again. A package is on his porch. Lights turned on after midnight. These comments became community sport. Karen positioned herself at the center of a neighborhood surveillance ring she'd built from paranoia and prejudice. She wasn't just reporting. She was recruiting. And the HOA rewarded her for it. In one meeting, Craig publicly thanked her for her dedication to the community. The applause lasted longer than it should have. I felt it from across the room like a weight on my spine. That applause wasn't for her vigilance, it was for her victory. She had turned me into the neighborhood threat, and they honored her for it. Every structure has a breaking point. Every system has a flaw that can be exploited. And every villain eventually crosses a line so bold, so reckless, that they reveal themselves. For Karen, that moment came when she began manufacturing evidence. Disappearing packages weren't enough for her anymore. She needed stronger proof, something irrefutable, something that would make the police step in where the HOA no longer could. So she escalated. She had Amazon misdeliver packages to my home so she could steal them later and claim I'd taken something that didn't belong to me. She waited for moments when I wasn't home, then sprinted across the street to snatch the boxes under the guise of correcting a mistake. Then she photographed the porch to show it empty and filed new reports claiming I concealed stolen goods. It was madness disguised as civic duty, and it was working. Neighbors believed the HOA emails because they came stamped with authority. They believed Karen because she spoke with the certainty of someone who had already written the ending of the story. They believed the rumors because no one questioned whether my skin color made me more vulnerable to manufactured suspicion. And with every lie accepted as truth, Karen tightened her hold on the HOA's power structure. She wasn't just abusing the system. She was becoming the system. And as long as she controlled the narrative, my voice didn't matter. But narratives shift when cracks appear. And the first crack formed when the police officer who responded to one of her reports asked to review my footage instead of rubber stamping her story. Karen didn't expect that. She thought her influence extended into every authority. But the moment the footage contradicted her claim, her grip faltered. It didn't break. Not yet. But it faltered enough for me to see an opening, a weakness in her armor. She had relied on the HOA's blind trust for too long. She forgot that real authority, the kind with legal weight, demanded evidence. And while she had rumors, I had started collecting proof. Every interaction she engineered became a data point. Every false report became documentation. Every disappearance became a timestamp. By the time I installed the cameras, I wasn't just defending myself. I was preparing for war. A quiet war. A documented war. A war fought through the same channels she used against me, but with truth instead of manipulation. Karen built a power structure around herself, but she didn't realize the one flaw that would be her undoing. People like her always escalate beyond their own intelligence. Survival taught me one truth. You cannot win a war you cannot prove exists. Karen had weaponized perception, rumor, and HOA authority. And those tools were powerful because they didn't require evidence, only repetition. She turned the neighborhood against me using nothing but whispers and emails that carried the HOA seal like a badge of legitimacy. But the moment she escalated from surveillance creep to active saboteur, the moment packages vanished with mathematical precision, I knew this wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a coordinated attack, meant to break me legally, socially, and psychologically. That meant I needed to collect everything she never expected me to hold. Evidence. Cold, objective, time-stamped truth. The kind that doesn't bend under pressure, doesn't distort with rumor, doesn't care about Karen's tears or Craig's excuses. The kind that would eventually crush her narrative like the fragile lie it was. So I installed cameras, Not the basic kind. Full coverage, high-resolution surveillance with night vision, cloud storage, encrypted backups, and overlapping angles. If Karen wanted a war, I was done fighting blind. The first day the cameras were active, I felt something shift inside me. Not peace, not safety, just preparation. I didn't tell Jennifer at first because I didn't want to burden her with what I suspected Karen was planning next. But I knew. I knew the way soldiers know when an ambush is coming. The neighborhood felt different. The air felt like it was holding its breath. And Karen watched my house with renewed intensity, as if she sensed I had changed the terrain under her feet. Her behavior sharpened. Her movements became quicker, more secretive. She paced her porch. She appeared at odd times with her phone angled like she was recording. She kept glancing at my doorway, my driveway, my windows. She thought she was the hunter, but she didn't realize she'd already become the prey. Then, Tuesday afternoon arrived. The day everything started unraveling for her. I was between surgeries at the hospital, scrubbing out and glancing at my phone, when a motion alert from the camera popped up. It was 2:41 p.m. The Amazon driver walked up my porch, dropped a package, photographed it, and left. I watched it in real time, thinking nothing unusual yet. 12 minutes later, another alert. I tapped the notification and froze. Karen Whitmore, walking with purpose. Not the slow, nosy stroll she pretended to take when spying. This was intent. She crossed the street without hesitation, without caution, like she was collecting mail from her own house. She stepped into my driveway, looked left, then right, scanning for witnesses. She didn't see the camera angled above the porch, the one she assumed wasn't there because it blended into the trim. She climbed my steps, picked up my package, tucked it under her arm, and walked straight back to her front door. Not rushed, not panicked, almost proud. I didn't feel shock. I didn't even feel anger. I felt confirmation. Karen had moved from surveillance to theft, from lies to criminal acts, from harassment to a pattern of behavior she couldn't explain away. I saved the footage instantly. 3 backups, different clouds, external drive. I sent a clip to Jennifer with one sentence. "I'm not crazy. Look what I just caught." She called me 30 seconds later, breathless, furious, terrified. She told me we needed to call the police immediately. And she was right. But something in me said to wait. Not out of mercy, not out of fear, but because I recognized operations like this. If Karen was bold enough to steal a package in broad daylight, she wasn't done. And if she had escalated this far, the HOA email would come next. The one she always sent after staging her little disappearing acts. At 3:18 p.m., it arrived. Another suspicious activity report. Another grainy photograph. Another pair of sentences designed to shape me into a criminal. This time, though, the report went further. The email noted, "Frequent deliveries to 2847 Maple Lane, suggesting potential resale operations or unauthorized activity." They inserted a line stating that the individual retrieving packages cannot be confirmed as a resident. They were building a criminal profile around me, one email at a time. And Karen was giving them the raw material. She was stealing my packages, then accusing me of theft, then framing her accusations as concern for community safety. If this had been any other decade, I would have been standing in handcuffs before I could blink. I called Craig again. Not calmly, not politely. I told him I had video proof. Proof, not suspicion, of the resident making these reports actively stealing packages from my property. His response told me everything I needed to know about the HOA board I was dealing with. He sighed. He dismissed me. He said I was overreacting. He defended Karen as a concerned neighbor contributing to community security. I repeated the part about the video. He told me to show it to the police. And that's when I understood that Craig wasn't neutral. He wasn't uninformed. He wasn't misguided. He was complicit. Because to him, the idea that I, a black man in his precious suburban development, might be the victim was a narrative too inconvenient for his worldview. So I called the police. I filed a report. I showed the officer the footage. He nodded. He scribbled notes. But even he seemed hesitant. Package theft was low priority, and Karen was already working angles elsewhere. Because when the officer crossed the street to question her, she lied again. She denied stepping outside. She denied leaving her house at all. She denied recognizing the package. She denied knowing anything about my property. She denied what the camera recorded in crystal clarity. And when the officer returned empty-handed, telling me it was my video against her denial, something cold settled inside me. The law wasn't going to save me by default. The HOA wasn't going to admit its failure. The neighbors weren't going to protect me. If I wanted justice, I had to build a case so airtight the truth would suffocate Karen's lies. And that meant documenting everything. I kept track of every camera alert, every instance of Karen stepping outside when I arrived home. Every HOA email, every timestamp, every glitch, every detail. The pattern was undeniable. Over 4 weeks, 4 more packages disappeared. 4 more HOA emails circulated. 4 more false claims were copied and pasted into the community inbox. My cameras caught every theft. Karen crossing the street. Karen scanning for witnesses. Karen lifting the packages. Karen carrying them home. Karen staging her photographs. Karen submitting reports hours later. She didn't realize she was being recorded from multiple angles. She didn't realize I had purchased cloud storage that kept backups on external servers she couldn't reach. She didn't realize every move she made was becoming part of a legal timeline. But the universe has a way of delivering what you need at the moment you need it most. And it came in the form of a small, unmarked package left at my door 2 days before the restraining order hearing she filed against me. Inside was a thumb drive. No name, no return address. Just a handwritten note in shaky script. I'm sorry for not coming forward sooner. I didn't know how bad it had gotten. These are from my doorbell. My husband says not to get involved, but what she's doing is wrong. I hope this helps. I opened the files, and my stomach clenched. The footage showed Karen standing at her window with binoculars, watching my house. It showed her photographing my driveway at all hours. It showed her rehearsing her thefts, walking to her porch with fake packages, practicing angles, staging timelines. It showed her coaching another neighbor on what to say if anyone asked about her concerns. It showed her dragging packages across the street after intentionally misdirecting deliveries. But the most damning file wasn't video. It was audio. 2 voices. One was Karen. The other was a woman I later learned was her friend. In the recording, Karen said exactly what she hid behind procedure, policy, and performance. She said she didn't trust people like him. She said neighborhoods like Riverside Meadows weren't meant for people like us. She said if I kept getting packages, they could build a case. She confessed to requesting misdeliveries. She confessed to reporting every late-night arrival. She confessed to documenting my movements because the neighborhood deserved someone who paid attention. And then she said the sentence that ended any illusion that this was anything other than a hate-fueled crusade. Eventually, the police will have to investigate properly. They just need enough evidence to see he doesn't fit here. I didn't move for a full minute after the recording ended. I just listened to the quiet hum of my laptop and felt the weight of what I had in my hands. Not suspicion, not fear, proof. Proof of theft, proof of stalking, proof of falsified reports, proof of conspiracy, proof of racial motivation, proof of everything she'd tried to bury under HOA nonsense and fabricated concern. That thumb drive wasn't just evidence, it was a weapon. The kind that could collapse her entire universe, the kind that could topple everything she built, the kind that could turn the tables so completely that even Craig couldn't pretend not to see the truth. I sent it all to Patricia. My lawyer's response came faster than expected. She didn't hesitate. She didn't question. She didn't soften her voice. She said, "Marcus, this is the smoking gun. We have her." And when Patricia said, "we," I knew Karen had just wandered into a battlefield she wasn't equipped to survive, because the truth was no longer scattered across disappearing packages and whispered accusations. It was consolidated, organized, verified, and backed by technology Karen didn't understand. The HOA couldn't save her, the police couldn't ignore it, and Karen couldn't talk her way around the sound of her own voice admitting to everything. She thought she could weaponize the HOA. She thought she could weaponize the police. But she didn't expect me to weaponize the truth. And once that truth entered the courtroom, there was no version of reality where she walked away unscathed. Everything she built was about to collapse. Courtrooms have a sound to them, a quiet pressure that settles against your ribs before the judge even walks in. A weight that reminds you this is where stories are dismantled and rebuilt in real time, where lies evaporate under fluorescent lights, and where people who thought they were untouchable learn how small their power becomes when evidence finally enters the room. The morning of Karen's restraining order hearing, that pressure felt different, sharper, heavier, because Karen hadn't just filed a false petition. She had created a performance piece meant to bury me under the same lies she'd been feeding the HOA and half the neighborhood. She thought she was about to finalize the narrative she'd spent months crafting. Me as the aggressor, her as the terrified white woman forced to defend her safety. She believed she'd walk in, tremble a little, dab her eyes, and watch the system snap to her defense. She was expecting applause. What she got instead was a collapse so complete it left the entire courtroom silent. When Patricia and I walked in, Karen was already seated at her table with her lawyer, a man who looked like he charged by the sigh. Karen sat ramrod straight, dressed in soft beige tones meant to signal innocence, her hair pulled back tight enough to hide the tremor in her posture. She didn't look angry. She looked triumphant, because she truly believed she'd engineered the perfect trap. The moment her eyes met mine, she gave a small, satisfied smile, as if she'd already won, and this hearing was a formality before the real punishment began. She didn't understand that the game was already over. She just didn't know it yet. Judge Lorraine Foster entered the room at 9 a.m. sharp, her presence dominating the space with quiet authority. A black woman in her 60s, sharp-eyed, steady-voiced, with the kind of posture that told you she had seen every kind of lie unfold before her bench. She didn't smile. She didn't soften. She simply took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and called the case. Whitmore v. Williams. Karen straightened, rehearsed expression ready. Patricia placed a hand on my arm, grounding me just long enough to remind me to stay silent until spoken to. The air felt electric, charged with the truth waiting to detonate. Karen's lawyer stood first. He read from her restraining order petition, reciting every lie she had crafted, that I watched her home, followed her on walks, intimidated her, created a hostile environment, and posed an ongoing threat to her safety. Karen nodded along with each sentence, performing distress with the precision of someone who'd practiced in the mirror. She clutched a folded tissue. She blinked hard at all the right moments. Anyone watching without context might have believed her. But Patricia was already preparing the demolition. When the lawyer sat, Judge Foster looked at me over her glasses. "Dr. Williams, how do you respond to these allegations?" she asked. Patricia stood so smoothly it felt rehearsed. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to present evidence that not only contradicts every claim in Miss Whitmore's petition, but demonstrates a months-long campaign of targeted harassment, false accusations, criminal theft, and racially motivated misconduct." Karen flinched. Her lawyer stiffened. The judge nodded once. "Proceed." It started slow. Patricia outlined the timeline. The suspicious activity emails, the thefts, the HOA's involvement. Karen shifted in her seat, confusion flickering across her face as she realized this wasn't a simple denial. This was a counterattack. Patricia continued, her voice calm but relentless, and the courtroom leaned into every word. She introduced the first exhibit, the video footage of Karen stealing packages from my porch. The screen played the clip in vivid clarity. Karen watched her own actions replayed, her face draining of color as the truth unfurled without mercy. Her lawyer whispered urgently to her, but she stared forward, frozen, as the footage repeated from multiple angles. She looked smaller each time the screen displayed her crossing my driveway, scanning for witnesses, and lifting my property like she owned it. Judge Foster didn't react outwardly, but her jaw tightened. Patricia presented the HOA emails next, each one projecting suspicion, each one crafted by Karen, each one implying criminal behavior from a homeowner with no evidence except her lies. The judge read them slowly, expression flattening into something cold. Karen shifted again, tugging at her sleeves now, the tissue forgotten in her hand. She wasn't trembling from fear. She was trembling because the narrative she built was burning down around her, and she recognized the sparks. Then came the neighbor's footage, the thumb drive that changed everything. The clips showed Karen watching my home through binoculars, taking photographs, rehearsing her package thefts, speaking with neighbors in hushed, conspiratorial tones. The courtroom watched in stunned silence. Even Karen's lawyer put his hands over his mouth, his earlier confidence evaporating under the weight of undeniable proof. Karen whispered something to him, her voice cracking, but he didn't answer. He had nothing left to give her. Patricia saved the audio recording for last. She pressed play without ceremony. Karen's voice filled the courtroom, dripping with entitlement, superiority, and racial venom. People like them. They don't belong here. Packages misdelivered on purpose. Building a case? He doesn't fit in neighborhoods like this. Each sentence hammered the air harder than the one before it. The judge's expression didn't change at first, but then her eyes narrowed, and a subtle shift in her posture signaled something fundamental had snapped inside her. When the recording ended, the silence was total. A heavy, suffocating hush settled over the courtroom. Karen sat perfectly still, her face pale, her hands shaking now for real. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She wasn't confused anymore. She wasn't triumphant. She was exposed. Completely, irrevocably exposed. Judge Foster leaned forward. "Miss Whitmore," she said, voice measured but ice cold, "did you make these statements?" Karen stammered. "That recording was taken out of context. I was just concerned about neighborhood safety." Patricia didn't need to respond. The judge already knew the truth. "Did you or did you not deliberately arrange for packages to be misdelivered to Dr. Williams's address so you could steal them and report him for fraud?" Karen blinked, tears forming, not from guilt, but from the realization that she no longer controlled the story. I was trying to establish a pattern of behavior," she said weakly. "A pattern you fabricated," the judge replied sharply. while simultaneously filing false reports and endangering a neighbor you targeted based on racial bias. Her lawyer stood abruptly, attempting to salvage the ruins. Your Honor, my client's statements were made in frustration, and her actions were misguided attempts to— Sit down, Judge Foster ordered without raising her voice. He sat. Karen looked like she'd been slapped. This, the judge said slowly, tapping the audio transcript with one finger, is not frustration. This is not misunderstanding. This is not a concerned citizen. This is a deliberate, malicious, racially motivated campaign of harassment supported by falsified reports and criminal acts. And it stops today. Karen's breath hitched. Her hands clenched. She shook her head violently, whispering, "No, no, no." But the judge wasn't finished. "Not only is Miss Whitmore's petition denied," she said, "I am issuing a restraining order against her, effective immediately. She is prohibited from coming within 100 yards of Dr. Williams, his family, or his property." Karen froze, eyes wide with disbelief. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution, and given the racial motivations evident in this evidence, I am forwarding the case to the California Attorney General for review under civil rights statutes." Karen's entire body sagged like her bones had given up. The same woman who spent months inventing crimes, fabricating narratives, and orchestrating community-wide suspicion now sat motionless, crumbling under the consequence she believed she'd never face. It was over. But the collapse didn't end in the courtroom. It spread. The DA moved fast. Investigators found years of similar behavior in her previous neighborhood. Families she had targeted and terrorized the same way she targeted mine. Once the charges were filed, Karen's life unraveled publicly. Her mugshot appeared on local news. Neighbors whispered not about me, but about her. The HOA scrambled, panicked, desperate to distance themselves from the woman they once applauded. Craig resigned before the civil suit even landed on his desk. Karen pled guilty because she had no other choice. Theft, false reports, mail fraud, harassment. When she was sentenced, prison, probation, counseling, restitution, she didn't look at me once. Because she knew the truth. She hadn't just lost. She'd been unmasked. Her collapse wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't explosive. It was silent. The kind of silence that follows a power-drunk tyrant realizing their reign wasn't a reign at all, just a delusion shattered by evidence they never thought anyone would gather. Victory isn't the moment your enemy falls. Victory is the moment you take control of the battlefield they once dominated. And after Karen's lies collapsed in open court, after her mugshot circulated through the same neighborhood she once commanded, after the HOA scrambled to rewrite policies they never should have ignored, the war shifted entirely into my hands. Not because I sought revenge out of rage, but because expertise turns retaliation into something precise, something deliberate, something unstoppable. I wasn't swinging wildly anymore. I was applying pressure exactly where the system had left itself exposed, forcing accountability into places that had ignored it for years. And that's where the real dismantling began. Once the criminal case was underway, Patricia and I shifted our focus to civil action. She approached it like a surgeon approaches a failing organ, with calculated intent, deep understanding of structural weakness, and no hesitation to cut precisely where needed. We weren't just suing for damages. We were documenting a system-wide failure, a pattern that went far beyond Karen's obsession. The HOA had enabled her. The board had amplified her. The neighborhood had adopted her suspicions without question. This wasn't just about one racist woman. It was about the infrastructure that let her thrive unchecked. So we built a case not just against Karen, but against the HOA itself. Patricia drafted a demand letter so devastating that even I, after months of enduring harassment, felt the impact of its precision. She referenced case law, state statutes, HOA bylaws, federal housing regulations, and discrimination precedents. She outlined each of Karen's lies, each theft, each falsified report, and tied them directly to the HOA's distribution of unverified accusations. Every email they sent became an act of defamation. Every forwarded report became negligence. Every failure to verify became complicity. The board didn't just ignore the truth. They helped Karen wage her campaign, and Patricia held them accountable line by line. When the HOA's insurance carrier reviewed the file, panic set in instantly. They knew they were exposed. They knew Karen's case was a nightmare they could no longer distance themselves from. They knew that if this went to trial, not only would they lose, but every HOA in the region would read the verdict and feel the tremors. So the board requested a meeting, a closed-door session. They wanted to negotiate, not from strength, from fear. I attended that meeting with Patricia, not to argue but to watch them confront the consequences of their failures. Craig wasn't present. He'd resigned 2 days earlier, citing medical reasons, though everyone knew he was fleeing the fallout. The remaining board members sat stiffly, avoiding eye contact. Their lawyer, a corporate attorney with a stack of documents trembling slightly in his hands, tried to open with apologies, explanations, excuses. Patricia cut through them instantly. She wasn't rude, she was exact. She outlined every violation, every misstep, every failure to investigate. She read portions of Karen's recording aloud until the board members visibly flinched. She made it clear the lawsuit would continue unless the HOA agreed not only to financial compensation, but to systemic change. And that's when the board broke. They agreed to settle. They agreed to revise the bylaws. They agreed to implement mandatory anti-discrimination training. They agreed to hire an independent review panel for complaints. They agreed to a verification process for suspicious activity reports. They agreed to stop treating racism as just a misunderstanding. They agreed because they had no choice. For years, they'd wielded authority like a weapon without understanding the responsibility tied to it. Now they were being forced to rebuild the system they'd allowed Karen to exploit. And I didn't have to raise my voice once. But my retaliation didn't end at the HOA. It extended into the very institutions Karen tried to use against me. Every police report she filed became evidence of her misconduct. Every officer who showed up at my door became part of the timeline. And when the Civil Rights Division of the Attorney General's office opened an investigation, the entire neighborhood saw the consequences of enabling a resident who weaponized emergency services for her own biases. Officers had to complete bias training. Dispatch had to review protocols for racially motivated 911 calls. Karen's lies had triggered a systemic response far greater than she ever imagined. Meanwhile, Patricia crafted the civil suit against Karen with surgical precision. We weren't after vengeance, we were after accountability with financial weight. Karen's homeowner's insurance initially resisted, attempting to argue that intentional acts weren't covered. Patricia countered by pointing out that the HOA's distribution of her reports implicated them, and their liability policy extended to claims of negligence. The pressure mounted until both insurers, the HOA's and Karen's, agreed to contribute toward the settlement. The amount was significant enough to change my children's futures. Not because Karen wanted to pay, but because she forfeited the right to avoid consequences the moment she weaponized race and authority against me. But the most powerful retaliation wasn't financial. It was transformative. After the dust settled, the hospital board approached me with a new role, Director of Diversity and Inclusion. They had followed the case. They had seen the public reaction. They understood the importance of addressing bias not just in neighborhoods, but within institutions that held life and death responsibility. The position wasn't ceremonial. It came with authority, resources, and a mandate to rebuild internal systems the way Patricia and I had rebuilt community ones. In this role, I wasn't just a victim reclaiming power. I was an expert using my experience to prevent future injustices. I began developing training modules for staff. I reviewed hiring practices. I implemented workshops for recognizing unconscious bias and weaponized reporting. I built support structures for young physicians of color. I created a reporting system for discriminatory incidents with real consequences attached. And slowly the hospital environment shifted. Fear became awareness. Silence became conversation. Defensive postures became accountability. That was retaliation, not in anger, but in expertise. Not tearing down, but reconstructing. Not revenge, but resolution with purpose. Jennifer noticed the change too. She saw the heaviness lift from my shoulders, not because the past was gone, but because I was no longer carrying it alone. Our kids saw it. Our neighbors saw it. Even the people who had once avoided me at the community pool saw it. And something else happened. Something I didn't expect. People began to come to me privately. Black families, Latino families, immigrant families, people who had dealt with their own Karens, their own weaponized HOAs, their own quiet smear campaigns. They asked how I fought it, how I documented, how I defended, how I won. I never intended to become an advocate, but circumstance made me one. Because once you've survived the kind of targeted harassment Karen engineered, your knowledge becomes a lifeline for people who feel trapped in similar cages. Retaliation isn't fury. Retaliation is clarity. It's the moment you stop reacting and begin directing. It's the moment you realize your enemy underestimated not your strength, but your capacity to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast them. Karen thought she could destroy my reputation, my peace, my safety. Instead, she destroyed her own life while forcing systemic reform, community accountability, and institutional change. She tried to erase me. Instead, she made me impossible to ignore. And by the time she stood in court for sentencing, prison time, probation, counseling, she didn't look at me. Not because she hated me, but because she finally understood something she never expected. I wasn't the threat. I was the consequence. Victory didn't arrive with celebration. It arrived with quiet, heavy stillness, the kind that settles after a storm tears through everything fragile and leaves behind only what was built to last. 2 years passed after Judge Foster dismantled Karen's lies in front of an entire courtroom. 2 years since the neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid me now waved with guilt stitched into their smiles. 2 years since the HOA went from a petty tribunal to an actual community organization forced to follow the rules they'd ignored for years. Life didn't snap back to normal after Karen was removed. It evolved into something steadier, something grounded, something earned. And there was a strange kind of power in realizing that my existence in Riverside Meadows no longer had to justify itself. I wasn't a suspect. I wasn't an outsider. I wasn't a problem waiting to be managed. I was simply home. Karen's house sold while she was still serving time. The for sale sign went up less than a month after her sentencing. No neighbors lingered around it. No curious whispers. No sympathy casseroles. Her name had become a quiet warning, an example of how far someone could fall when they believed their hate was protected by procedure. When the moving truck arrived and the new owners stepped out, a married couple with a toddler who squealed every time he saw my dog, The neighborhood didn't tense. It exhaled. They introduced themselves immediately, asked about school recommendations, invited us to their place for barbecue before they'd even finished unpacking. There was no tension, no suspicion, no watching from behind curtains. Just neighbors. The way it should have been from the beginning. The HOA, once a weapon Karen wielded with precision, now functioned the way these boards are supposed to. They sent updates about landscaping schedules, community picnics, pool repairs. No crime warnings disguised as racist dog whistles. No unverified reports blasted out to the entire neighborhood. They put verification protocols in place, installed complaint review committees, required training Karen would have sneered at. And while those changes came too late to stop the damage she caused, they prevented the next version of her from rising. That mattered. Craig Henderson, who once dismissed my concerns with patronizing sighs, resigned before the lawsuit concluded. His name was never spoken aloud at board meetings again. He became an afterthought in a story that exposed the rot he allowed under his watch. The new board president, a retired public defender named Ellen, asked to meet me privately the first month she took over. She apologized, not with excuses, not with performative guilt, not with the empty language of someone afraid of liability. She apologized because she understood deeply how wrong the system had been and how easily it had surrendered to bias. She asked what we needed as a community to prevent another Karen. And for the first time since moving into Riverside Meadows, I felt like the HOA wasn't something to fear. It was something I could trust. My children healed faster than I did. Kids do that. Sophie rarely mentions the morning police knocked on our door, demanding to search for a non-existent stolen laptop. MJ doesn't remember the stairs at the community pool or the mailbox with "thief" spray painted across it. Their memories reshaped themselves around the safety we rebuilt. The friendships returned, stronger than before. Birthday parties filled the yard again. Neighbors invited us to gatherings without hesitation. The fear that once saturated every walk to the mailbox evaporated. And with time, the hypervigilance that once sat under my skin like a live wire softened too. I still checked the cameras. Habit doesn't vanish overnight. But I no longer checked them to see if Karen was watching. I checked them because they were simply part of my home now. Jennifer stood by me through every step of the ordeal, anchoring me in moments when everything felt like it was closing in. Our relationship didn't break under the pressure. It forged itself into something stronger. We talked more. We expected less from the world, but more from each other. We made choices together. We rebuilt trust in our community on our terms, not the terms forced on us by fear. And when the hospital offered me the new position, when they recognized the weight of what happened and the potential for something transformative, Jennifer was the first to say, "This is your second calling." She was right. Becoming Director of Diversity and Inclusion wasn't just a title. It was a responsibility carved directly out of the scars Karen tried to leave on my life. I trained staff on recognizing weaponized bias. I created reporting pathways that didn't evaporate into bureaucracy. I helped families navigate discrimination both inside and outside medical settings. I became a resource, a voice, a force. Not because I wanted to talk about what happened, but because I refused to let anyone else face what I faced without support. Pain turned into purpose. Purpose turned into structure. Structure turned into change. Karen being gone didn't mean the memory of what happened disappeared. Sometimes I still think about that moment in my driveway. The officer's hand hovering near his holster, my daughter watching from the window, my own package shaking in my hands as I tried to prove I lived in my own home. That memory doesn't vanish. It sharpens me. It reminds me how quickly bias can be weaponized, How easily systems can crumble when the wrong person learns how to manipulate them. How dangerously close I came to becoming another black man criminalized for breathing in the wrong neighborhood. But it also reminds me how everything changed because I refused to be silent. I documented. I persisted. I stood my ground. And when the truth surfaced, it didn't just protect me, it reshaped the very structure that allowed my harassment to thrive. Every new policy, every training module, every neighbor who thinks twice before weaponizing fear, every family who no longer feels alone because of the work Patricia and I built. Those are victories Karen can't touch. People sometimes ask if I ever think about her. The truth is, I don't. At least not in anger. She was a problem that got solved, a threat that got neutralized, a symptom of a system that now has safeguards she accidentally inspired. She moved out of state after her release. Rumors say she lives with a son somewhere in Florida. I don't wish her well or ill. I simply don't need her to exist in my world anymore. Because this is our home. This is our neighborhood. This is our peace, rebuilt brick by brick after someone tried to splinter it apart. And the ending isn't loud or triumphant or dramatic. It's simple. It's steady. It's earned. The same neighbors who once looked away now look me in the eye. The same HOA that once broadcast my existence as a threat now protects residents from the abuse they allowed. And the same man Karen tried to criminalize stands exactly where he belongs, unbroken, unshaken, and absolutely immovable. Karen thought she could use power to destroy me. Instead, she taught me how to take it. HOA went dead silent.